They said she was too fat to be loved, too ugly to be seen, so her mother gave her away like a burden, like an animal up to the mountains where the old man lived alone. Folks in town whispered that he was mad, maybe worse, but what if the truth was something stranger? What if he saw beauty where no one else did? What if he treated her like a wife, not with shame, but with honor? This is the story they won't tell at Sunday service. What really happened in that cabin? And why did the town end up cheering for her? When a mother turns her back and the mountains hold their breath, one question remains. Was she abandoned or chosen? And who really saw her worth first? Every time I read your comments, I'm reminded that these stories reach hearts far beyond the hills. If you believe in the power of kindness, dignity, and second chances, then you're part of this story too. Let me know which state you're watching from. I love seeing how far these tales travel. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and help us keep sharing stories that speak to the soul. The morning sky was pale with frost when Lettie's mother told her to pack her things. She didn't use words of love or comfort, just pointed toward the satchel on the floor and said, "You'll be going with Mr. Dalton today. He's headed north, and you'd best not argue." Lettie, 17, round-faced and soft with sorrow, didn't ask questions. She had learned long ago that her mother's heart was not a place where questions lived. Her body, larger than other girls', had always been a source of shame. Not her own shame, but her mother's, worn like a badge of bitterness for the whole town to see. Mr. Dalton didn't speak much either. He smelled of tobacco and stale bread, and when he looked at Lettie, it was with a kind of weary disinterest, like he'd been tasked with hauling an unwanted trunk across state lines. She climbed into his wagon without a word, her satchel clutched to her chest, and the rickety wheels began their slow turn up the dirt road that curved through the hills. She didn't cry, not because she wasn't sad, but because she had cried too many times before, and it had never changed anything. Behind her, the town of Sycamore Ridge carried on as if nothing had happened. A few neighbors peeked through their lace curtains. One woman whispered, "Poor thing," and then closed the window. Another shook her head and said, "That girl needed to be dealt with. No good would have come from her sticking around." And that was the extent of the morning gossip, whispered like prayers for the dead. Mr. Dalton's wagon creaked higher and higher into the wooded ridges, and by late afternoon they had passed the last homestead. The trees grew thick, the road less a road and more a memory of one. Without ceremony, Mr. Dalton reined in the horse and turned to Lettie. "This here's as far as I go. You'll find the old man's place not too far east. Keep walking and you'll hit it by nightfall if you're lucky." He handed her the satchel and offered nothing more. Then he turned the wagon and rode off, leaving Lettie standing in a bed of brown pine needles, the wind tugging at her skirt. She didn't move at first. The silence was louder than any shouting she'd ever heard. Birds fluttered in the branches above, and somewhere in the distance, a river muttered its endless song. Lettie had never been this far from people, from buildings, from the slow churn of town life, but she wasn't afraid. Or perhaps she was too numb to be. The walk was slow. Her shoes, too tight from years of neglect, bit into her feet. The trees seemed to lean in, curious about the girl who walked alone. Hours passed. Twilight slipped in like a soft blanket, and still she walked, led by nothing but instinct and the faintest trail. Then, through the trees, a chimney appeared, stone and solid, with a thin line of smoke rising into the cold sky. She hesitated. The townspeople had told stories about a man who lived out here. A monster, some said. A hermit who once killed a man with a glance. Children dared each other to wander too close, and grown folk crossed themselves when his name was mentioned. They called him the Mountain Man, like he wasn't human at all. Lettie stepped forward anyway. The trees had long since swallowed the path. Night had draped itself over the ridge, heavy and black, and the cold had started to bite like teeth. Lettie's legs moved without direction, her breath shallow, her lips cracked and bleeding. The satchel had grown heavier by the hour until she dropped it somewhere among the pines without noticing. Her dress, thin and unlined, clung to her body like wet paper. The wind tore through her hair, dragging strands across her cheeks like whips. She hadn't eaten since the morning, and even then, it had only been a heel of dry bread. Hunger clawed at her belly, sharp and relentless. Branches snagged her sleeves. Her fingers were numb, raw where they gripped tree trunks for balance. She was walking uphill without knowing it, feet sliding on the frosted ground, heart thudding like a bird caught in a cage. The silence of the forest pressed in on her, broken only by the distant hoot of an owl and the low, steady breath of the mountains themselves. Her thoughts blurred into shapes: her mother's voice calling her useless, Mr. Dalton's indifference, the whispers of the townsfolk. All of it faded beneath the roar of survival. Then her foot caught on a root, and she fell hard, face first, into the dirt. She didn't get up. Her cheek rested on the frozen soil, her breath coming in ragged bursts. The cold seeped in, deep and final. She closed her eyes and let the darkness pull at her. Maybe, she thought, this was how it ended, not with screaming or violence, but with silence and sky and the quiet forgetting of a girl no one wanted. A crunch of boots broke the stillness. At first, she thought it was the wind playing tricks, but then the footsteps grew closer, deliberate, heavy. Not a deer, not a wolf, a man. Her eyes fluttered open, but she couldn't lift her head. Through blurred vision, she saw only boots, worn leather, caked in mud and pine needles, then the edge of a thick coat, the gleam of a belt buckle. He stood over her without a word. Silas Granger had lived alone for 10 winters. The cabin behind him was barely more than a stone box with a roof, but it was his. He knew every trail, every rustle of the forest. When he saw the girl crumpled in the brush, he felt no panic, just calculation. She was young, not from the hills, left behind or sent away. Maybe a trap, maybe not. He crouched beside her, one hand on the rifle slung over his back. Her skin was blue-tinged, her body trembling, but her face, round and soft and slack with exhaustion, stirred something in him he did not recognize at first. Then he saw her fingers. Small, dirty nails bitten short, like his daughter's had been. His throat tightened, sudden and unfamiliar. He should have left her. That's what the smart man would do. Let the cold take her. Trouble didn't belong in the hills. But he couldn't. With a grunt, he lifted her easily into his arms. She didn't weigh much, despite what the townspeople would have said. Her head fell against his shoulder like it belonged there. He carried her through the dark toward the cabin, the only light a flicker of fire inside. Behind him, the wind picked up. The first thing she felt was warmth, not the weak kind that drifted from a distant sun, but the full-bodied embrace of fire, thick wool, and the scent of smoke-soaked pine. Lettie stirred beneath a heavy blanket, her face buried in something soft. For a long moment, she kept her eyes shut, afraid that if she opened them, the warmth would vanish, and the cold would take her again. But the crackle of fire coaxed her forward. She opened her eyes to dim amber light flickering across log walls. The cabin was small, just a single room, but it was solid, built from stone and timber, with shelves carved into the walls and tools hanging in careful order. A kettle hissed above the hearth, and the scent of baking bread filled the air so thickly it made her stomach twist in longing. She sat up too fast, and the room spun. A deep grunt from the corner made her freeze. There he was, Silas Granger, sitting in a chair near the fire, his back hunched, a thick flannel shirt stretched over his broad frame. His beard was wild, his face lined like dry riverbeds. One hand rested on his knee. The other held a whittling knife and a block of wood that he hadn't touched since she woke. He was watching her not with anger, but with something unreadable, ancient as the hills. Lettie pulled the blanket tighter around her. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came. Her voice had dried up in her throat. Instead, she looked around, searching for her bag, her boots, anything that would tell her this wasn't a dream. But the only thing near her was a small wooden tray placed on the floor, a thick slice of bread, still steaming, a tin cup of water, a folded cloth napkin. Silas didn't say a word. With trembling hands, she reached for the bread. The crust crumbled as she broke it, soft inside, and the first bite filled her mouth with salt and warmth and memory. Her eyes burned. She chewed slowly, not because she wasn't hungry, but because rushing felt like it might shatter the spell. Still, he said nothing. He simply whittled, slow and methodical, shaving curls of wood that dropped like feathers to the floor. The silence was not cruel, it was deliberate, like a space carved out for thought. Lettie didn't understand it, but she didn't fear it. In her mother's house, silence had meant judgment. Here, it felt like something else, a quiet agreement. I won't ask, and I won't tell. Not yet. When she finished the bread, she placed the napkin neatly on the tray. Silas stood then, towering, the chair groaning beneath him as he moved. He picked up the tray, glanced at her once long enough to make her flinch, and then turned away. No praise, no questions. Just the sound of boots on wood and the low thud of a cupboard door closing. She whispered, "Thank you," though she wasn't sure if he heard. He paused, only for a second. Then he sat back down. The fire crackled. The wind outside howled. Inside there was bread and silence and something else neither of them had a name for yet. The next morning, the blanket was still wrapped around her, but the fire had burned low. The cabin was quiet again, and Silas was nowhere in sight. A thin band of daylight slipped through the window, laying a soft stripe across the floorboards. Lettie sat up slowly, her body sore but no longer frozen. Every part of her ached, feet blistered, joints stiff, stomach hollow, but she was warm, alive, and alone in a room that did not look at her with disgust. That was more than she'd had in years. A slip of bread sat on the table with another tin cup of water beside it. She ate slowly, glancing toward the door. No lock, no chain, no threats. She could leave if she wanted to. Her mother's voice rose in her mind like sour smoke. "You think anyone'll keep you?" Fat and dull, and always underfoot. The shame flickered, but it did not burn the way it used to. Instead, she looked around the cabin. Dust clung to corners. Pans needed cleaning. A stack of firewood sat half-cut near the hearth. A shovel leaned unused by the door. Outside, she could hear the soft bleating of goats and the occasional creak of a fence gate in the wind. She stood up. Her shoes were missing, but she wrapped her feet in old cloth from a chest near the door and stepped out into the cold. The air bit her cheeks, and the light was sharp, but the world did not reject her. The goats were nervous at first, shifting and snorting, but she kept her hands low and her movements quiet. She'd watched farmhands back in town, she knew enough. She refilled their water and tossed hay into their trough. One of the smaller ones edged forward, nosing her fingers with curiosity. She smiled and let it sniff. From the trees, Silas watched. He'd left early, axe slung over his shoulder, expecting to come back to an empty cabin, maybe a broken cup, maybe nothing. He wasn't sure why he brought her back at all. She was trouble-wrapped in soft skin and sad eyes, and he didn't need any of it. But when he returned and saw her barefoot, careful, her hands gentle as she worked, he stopped in the shadows and said nothing. She didn't see him. He watched her scatter seed for the chickens, sweep the porch, and wipe soot from the window with the sleeve of her dress. Not once did she cry. Not once did she ask when he'd send her away or why he hadn't spoken. She just did the work, quiet and steady, as if she'd always been there. Later that day, when she came back inside, her hands red from cold, she stirred the stew pot with a wooden spoon she'd cleaned herself. Silas entered without a word, set a bundle of firewood down beside the hearth, and glanced at her. She didn't flinch this time. She nodded. That night, they ate in silence. The fire crackled. She didn't ask to leave. He didn't ask why she stayed. But in the long pause between spoonfuls, something passed between them, not warm yet, but real. She was still there the next morning. And the next. And the next. The storm rolled in without warning, as they often did in the high hills. One moment, the trees stood quiet and still. The next, the sky had turned a violent shade of gray, and snow came down like a curtain being drawn over the world. Silas had seen storms like this before, seen them bury cabins and trap grown men like mice in a sealed box. He moved fast, hauling wood indoors, shuttering the windows, double-checking the chimney. He worked like a man who knew what it meant to survive. Lettie helped where she could, her hands clumsy from the cold, but her eyes bright with urgency. She never complained, not when the wind howled like wolves through the cracks, not when the roof groaned under the weight of snow. not even when her fingers turned red and raw from hauling water to boil. But on the second day, her hands trembled. By evening, she was sweating under her blanket, her skin flushed and damp, her breathing shallow and uneven. Silas had seen fever before, seen it take children from their mothers, seen it break strong men in the night. But this time, he didn't turn away. He pulled the blanket tighter around her, stoked the fire until it roared, and brought water to her lips with a wooden spoon. "Drink," he muttered, rough and low. She didn't answer, only groaned and turned her face to the wall. He dipped a rag into the snow melt and placed it on her forehead. Her skin was hot, too hot, and her breath rattled. She murmured something he couldn't catch. Then again, clearer, "Pa? Pa?" Silas froze. The word hung in the air like smoke. She wasn't looking at him. Her eyes fluttered, lost in fever. But the word had left her mouth soft and certain. "Pa." He sat back, the spoon falling into the basin. For a long moment, he stared at her, this girl with dirt still beneath her nails, with a softness that the world had tried to crush and failed. She didn't belong to him. She wasn't his child. But somewhere, in that broken, sweating voice, he heard his daughter's laugh echo from 10 winters ago. A memory, a wound. He stayed beside her through the night. When she thrashed, he held her shoulders gently. When she whimpered, he whispered low, meaningless things, just sound, just presence. He read from the old Bible once, not for faith, but for rhythm. He did not sleep. He could not. Her fever became his war, and he fought it with rags, with firewood, with trembling hands that had not touched another living soul in years. By dawn, the worst had passed. She lay still, breath calmer, sweat cooling. Silas sat in the rocker by her bedroll, eyes ringed with exhaustion, staring into the fire like it held answers. His body ached, his fingers were numb, but she was still breathing. And for the first time in a decade, he said a prayer, not aloud, not with form or flourish, just a silent thanks in the dark, because the girl had called him Pa, and he hadn't hated the sound of it. The snow didn't melt all at once. It receded slowly, with a stubbornness that matched the mountain's mood, dripping from branches and pulling back like a tide from the cabin's steps. And, as winter released its grip, Lettie began to move with a new kind of rhythm, quiet but steady, like a stream freed from ice. Her strength returned, first color rising to her cheeks, her steps growing lighter, her laughter appearing in soft bursts when the goats nipped her skirt or the hens refused to be herded. Then came her voice, singing low melodies while hanging clothes to dry, or humming while mending Silas's frayed shirts. She began to draw again, too. It started with the side of the cabin, her finger carving patterns into the frost on the windows. Later, when she found charcoal left in a drawer, she filled scrap wood and bark with images, mountains in soft arcs, goats in sharp lines, a crooked cabin with smoke rising like a question. She never asked if she was allowed to use the charcoal. She just did. And Silas never stopped her. He watched from the shadows, the way he always had, through the edge of a doorway, from the barn loft, while she planted early root vegetables in the thawing soil. Through a cracked window as she sat by the fire, tongue peeking from the corner of her mouth in focus, sketching something he could never quite see. She moved with care, not because she was afraid, but because she had learned to treat peace like something sacred. And in return, the land began to yield eggs in the morning, wild onions in the grove, the hint of green in a patch she'd cleared behind the cabin. She sang to the dirt as she worked. Silas tried not to feel it, tried to keep the wall up, the same one he'd built when the fire took everything, when the town whispered he should have saved them. He'd chosen solitude because it hurt less, because no one needed him and he needed no one. But Lettie's presence made the silence feel different now, not emptier, richer, somehow, full of things unsaid and moments not quite named. He caught himself watching her more often, not with suspicion, but with something harder to admit. Once, he found a wooden figure on the windowsill, a carving of a goat with clumsy legs and kind eyes. She didn't mention it. He didn't ask, but he left it there, untouched. That night, while fixing a broken hinge, Silas paused when he heard her singing inside. The same melody his daughter used to hum while brushing her doll's hair. A tune he hadn't heard in 10 years, now carried on a voice just as soft but older, worn with weather and will. He set the hinge down, rubbed his eyes. She wasn't his daughter, but she wasn't a stranger either. Lettie had taken the cold, hard earth around his life and tilled it, softened it with laughter, with warmth, with the stubborn belief that something beautiful could grow even in the shadow of grief. And something was growing. He could feel it. Not joy, not yet, but the shape of it, blooming beneath the frost. The day the past rose up was clear and windless, one of those rare afternoons when the sun shone warm enough to fool you into thinking spring had truly come. Lettie was kneeling by the garden, her fingers caked in black soil, coaxing sprigs of thyme to stand straight. Her hair had fallen from its braid, wisps clinging to her damp cheek. Silas stood a few paces away, splitting kindling with clean, methodical strokes. He watched her more than he watched the wood. Without looking up, he said, "Come with me." His voice was low, almost hoarse. Lettie looked over, confused, wiping her hands on her apron. He didn't wait for a reply, just turned and started toward the tree line behind the cabin. She rose quickly, brushing dirt from her dress, and followed. They walked in silence. The trail was narrow, half forgotten, winding through birch and fir. After a few minutes, they reached a clearing no larger than a sitting room. It held no marker, no fence, just a small mound of earth beneath a crooked cedar tree, the grass grown soft and thick over time. "She was 6, Silas said, barely above a whisper. Lettie looked at him, her throat tightening. "My daughter's name was Ruth. My wife, Clara, died in the fire too. Wasn't big, just the stove caught wrong one night when I was out hunting. I came back to smoke, to silence. Found Ruth out back, like she'd tried to crawl away from it, doll still in her hand." He let out a bitter sound that was neither a laugh nor a sob. "Buried them both here, Clara farther down. This was Ruth's favorite spot," said the tree looked like it was dancing. Lettie's gaze dropped to the ground. A wildflower had sprung near the edge of the mound. Her heart ached with a quiet, terrible understanding. Silas crouched, knees creaking. From his coat, he pulled a small tin box, the edges singed, one side warped by heat. He opened it slowly, like it might crumble in his hands. Inside was a charred music box, the kind with a winding key and tiny ballerina. The dancer was gone, melted or lost, but the box itself, blackened though it was, still held the faint shape of what it had been. "She used to wind it every night," he murmured, "even when it didn't play right," said the silence meant the music was sleeping. His hands trembled. Lettie knelt beside him, unsure if she should speak, unsure if he would break if she did. She didn't touch the box. She didn't touch him. She simply sat there, the weight of his grief folding into the air between them. For a long time, they stayed like that. Then Silas's breath hitched, and he wept. Not the kind of tears that came in trickles, but deep, heaving sobs that tore from his chest like something wrenched loose after years buried beneath stone. His shoulders shook, his head bowed, and the music box sat in his lap like a relic of another life. Lettie didn't cry. She didn't move. She listened, not to comfort him, not to fix what couldn't be fixed, but to honor it, to carry it, to let him know that someone still saw, still heard, still remembered. The tree above them swayed gently, and the world felt still. The man who had buried a doll had finally let someone stand beside the grave. The river, thawed now and rushing with snowmelt, carved a silver path through the valley below the cabin. Lettie sat by its edge with her skirts tucked beneath her knees, a slab of bark balanced on her lap, and a bundle of crushed berries, soot, and flower petals smeared onto stones beside her. She'd fashioned a brush from goat hair and a twig, clumsy but good enough. The morning sun warmed her back as she worked, her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. She was painting the view across the water trees with their first blush of green, the glint of rock in the current, and a silhouette of the cabin in the distance. Her fingers stained red and blue. She didn't notice the trapper watching from the trees. He had come to check his lines, to gather pelts before heading into town. What he found instead was something far more curious. The mountain man's cabin had always been a place of whispers, a place folks avoided. But now, here was a girl plump, pink-cheeked, and humming to herself while painting the world like it belonged to her. He stepped back into the woods and made his way down the ridge, shaking his head. By the time he reached Sycamore Ridge, the story had changed. They say she was fat as a pig and painted with berry blood, he told the general store owner, with a grin full of missing teeth. Swear she was talking to the river like it could talk back. Mountain Man's got himself a witch girl now, mad in the head, living up there like they're married. Within the hour, the tale had twisted again. By sunset, it reached the pastor's wife. That hermit up there took in a sinful girl with devilish eyes. She paints unholy symbols by moonlight, and no one knows what he's done to her. The town, always eager for scandal, latched on like wolves. Whispers slithered through sewing circles and pews, around dry goods counters and barber chairs. They didn't need truth, they needed spectacle. They remembered Lettie only vaguely, the shy, awkward girl whose mother had always spoken with tight lips and tighter eyes. It made sense, in a cruel way, that she'd end up in the woods with a man like Silas Granger. Some said she'd bewitched him, others claimed he'd taken her by force. No one asked how she was. No one cared what she painted. Back at the cabin, Lettie hung her finished work near the hearth, a rough but lovely scene of the valley in spring. Silas didn't say much, only looked at it once, nodded slightly, and returned to sharpening his knife. But he built her a shelf for the next painting, and another after that. Neither of them knew what was being said in town. Not yet. But the world beyond the trees was stirring again, and the river, though beautiful, never carried a secret for long. The sun glinted off his pocket watch as Mr. Elias Pritchard clicked it shut and slipped it back into his vest. He stood at the edge of the post office porch, leaning slightly on a polished cane he didn't need, watching the townspeople with narrowed eyes. The news had reached him that morning, half-whimpered from the lips of the preacher's boy, who'd heard it from his aunt, who'd heard it from the trapper. A fat girl painting wild things by the river, living with Silas Granger. Of all people. He turned the words over in his mind, like a coin, rubbing them smooth and sharp at once. He remembered Lettie's mother, Elise, in her youth, pale hair pinned tight, voice like a bitter wind. She had spurned him once, embarrassed him, really turning down his advances in front of half the town. Said he wasn't decent. Said she'd rather raise her daughter alone than marry a man with empty eyes. Her husband hadn't lasted long after that, drank himself to death in less than a year, and Elise? She grew hard, cruel, and now her daughter had gone missing, or worse, taken in by the old hermit who lived beyond the law. Pritchard smoothed a wrinkle in his coat and turned to the postmaster. "You still got that deed to the Granger place in your files?" he asked casually. The postmaster blinked. "Don't think so, Mr. Pritchard. That land's been in his name for years, paid in full." "Why?" Pritchard smiled, but it didn't touch his eyes. "Just a matter of public concern. Rumor says he's harboring a girl maybe not of sound mind or age." The word hung in the air. Sound mind, age. In a town like Sycamore Ridge, you didn't need proof, just implication. Just enough suggestion to stir fear, to awaken the stale breath of righteousness and make it stink like fresh judgment. By sundown, Pritchard had drafted a letter to the county magistrate, requesting an investigation into Granger's unlawful guardianship of a vulnerable girl. He attached an affidavit from a half-blind shopkeeper who swore he'd heard screams from the hills last fall and cited the need for moral action. But beneath all his false concern lay his true ambition. That land. Granger's plot stretched across a valuable ridge, untouched timber, a clean water source, and a hidden mineral vein. Pritchard suspected lay beneath the north slope. He'd had his eye on it for years, but the old man refused to sell, not even after 3 official offers and 1 veiled threat. But now, with a scandal stirring and the town ready to listen, Pritchard saw his chance. He would paint himself the hero. He would ride up that mountain with lawmen at his side, pronounce the girl endangered, accuse Granger of misdeeds too vile to speak aloud, and offer to rehabilitate the property in the name of decency and order. He smirked at the thought. No one remembered a refusal. They remembered a rescue. And Elias Pritchard had waited long enough to claim what he believed the world owed him. The letter was pinned to the church doors by mid-morning, thick parchment, heavy with ink and self-importance, sealed with the red wax stamp of Elias Pritchard's office. By noon, A copy had been posted outside the general store, and another handed to the pastor, who read it aloud from the pulpit that evening, his voice tight with indignation and poorly disguised relish. "Friends of Sycamore Ridge," the letter began, "it is with a heavy heart and moral conviction that I bring to your attention a matter most grave." It spoke of corruption hiding in plain sight. A girl of unnatural size and silence, taken into the woods by a man long believed to be dangerous, even mad. It warned of godlessness, of perversion, of something unwholesome and unwatchful happening beyond the town's reach. The girl, known as Lettie, it said, was discarded by her mother, only to be ensnared by a man with no family, no church, and no witness. What claim does he have to her? What right? The congregation sat in stunned silence. The pastor, Reverend Clemens, folded the paper slowly, with trembling fingers, and looked over the heads of his parishioners. "We have a duty," he said, "to protect the innocent, to cast light on what's done in darkness. I know many of you have heard the rumors, painting in the river, singing like a siren, living in sin. I say now pray for her soul, and prepare. The Lord does not forget." The next day, Lettie found the copy nailed to a tree near the base of the trail. She read it once, then again, the blood draining from her cheeks. The words felt like fire against her skin, unnatural, bewitched, unclean. Each accusation a wound she'd already carried in silence, now carved into bark for the world to see. She walked back to the cabin slowly, numb and shaking. She didn't tell Silas what she'd read. She didn't have to. That night, after he had gone to bed, she packed a small bundle bread, the wooden goat he'd carved her, a worn shawl. She opened the door to the dark woods, the cold waiting like a familiar ghost. She had no plan, only a truth she believed deep in her bones. She didn't want to bring shame to the only person who had ever looked at her and not flinched. If she left, maybe the storm would pass, maybe the town would forget. She stepped onto the porch and stopped. Silas stood by the firewood pile, axe in hand, eyes locked on her. He didn't speak at first. The only sound was the wind in the trees and the creak of the porch boards beneath her feet. Then, finally, he said, "Don't go." The words were soft, rough, real. "I've been alone a long time, Lettie. Thought that was safer, easier. But since you came here, it ain't been easy, but it's been alive. And I'd rather face their hate with you here than live quiet with you gone." Her breath caught. He didn't reach for her, didn't block her path. He only waited. And for the first time in her life, someone wanted her to stay. So she did. Miss Hester Maynard arrived back in Sycamore Ridge the same way she'd left it alone, upright and unbothered by stares. Her traveling cloak, worn thin at the sleeves, smelled faintly of sage and lavender. She walked with a stiff limp from an old injury, but her gaze was sharp, and her voice when she used it carried the weight of memory. The town hadn't seen her in 3 years, not since she left to tend to her sister's failing heart across the ridge. But now she was back, and the first thing she did was march to the post office and tear down the letter Elias Pritchard had nailed up. "Slop and poison," she muttered, crumpling the page in her fist. That boy never could stomach being told no. Word spread quickly. By noon, she'd had tea at the milliner's, spoken plainly with the blacksmith's wife, and paid a visit to Reverend Clemens, who met her on the church steps with a tight-lipped smile. "Miss Maynard," he said, dipping his head, "didn't expect to see you back so soon." "I imagine you didn't," she replied. "I hear there's been a great scandal brewing in your sermons, about a girl and a man living in the hills." He shifted uncomfortably. "It's our duty to speak on what may corrupt the innocent." Her eyes narrowed. "I was the one who delivered Silas Granger's daughter. I was there when he buried her. And I was there the morning after the fire when he tried to throw himself into the river rather than face the sun without them. You think a man like that would lay a finger on a girl who needed protecting?" Clemens flushed, but said nothing. "I've seen men who do evil," she continued. "Silas Granger is not among them." By evening, her words had reached the parlor rooms and porches of Sycamore Ridge. Hester Maynard wasn't just a midwife, she was a keeper of truth, someone who had delivered half the town's children and sat beside half their mothers in death. Her opinion mattered, more than the pastor's piety, more than Pritchard's official letters. At supper, old Mr. Wick, from the feed store, leaned across the table to his wife and whispered, "If Maynard says he's not guilty, then maybe we ought to listen before we hang him with our words." Others agreed in murmurs, tentative and unsure, but it was enough. The air shifted, the gossip slowed, doubt crept in, and Miss Maynard, her cloak damp from rain, made her way up toward the ridge before dark. Not all the way to the cabin, but close enough to look up through the trees, where smoke curled gently from Silas's chimney. She stood there for a long time, her arms crossed, eyes glassy with old grief and new resolve. "She's safe with you," she whispered into the wind, "and that should count for something." It was the first voice raised in defense of the mountain man and the girl they called Strange. It would not be the last. The wind picked up the night Pritchard rode into town with the judge at his side. Dust curled in little devils along the main street, shutters slammed against windows, and shopkeepers locked their doors earlier than usual. Folks could feel it, something dark had been stirred, and it wasn't going to settle easy. Pritchard, dressed in his best navy coat and shining boots, walked the judge from the station to the boarding house like he was parading a prized bull, pausing only to nod at onlookers and whisper to those with open ears. He moved like a man with righteousness in his pocket. "We'll hold the hearing 3 days hence," the judge announced, reading from the paper Pritchard handed him. "This concerns the welfare of a minor and possible criminal misappropriation of land. I expect full attendance." The words spread like sparks on dry grass. By dawn, the town was split. Some, stirred by fear and old superstitions, muttered that Granger had bewitched the girl. Others, now less certain, glanced over their shoulders and whispered the name Hester Maynard with cautious respect. But most remained silent, caught in the space between curiosity and cowardice. Pritchard wasn't silent. He moved through the town like a conductor before a storm, directing whispers into warnings, rumors into righteousness. He tapped shoulders and slid letters under doors. "This is about decency," he said. "About law. About protecting a girl who doesn't know she's in danger." But his eyes gleamed with something far colder, possession. Miss Maynard tried to speak sense at the store, at the church, even in front of the saloon. "She's not in danger," she told them. "She's found a place where she's safe. That girl's more alive than she's ever been." But for every voice of reason, Pritchard had 10 lies dressed up in law and printed on good paper. Up on the ridge, Silas read the notice Maynard had delivered by hand, her expression grim. "They want to drag her down there," she said. "Put her in front of the whole town like a show horse. Judge says it's for clarity and community assurance. But we both know what they really want." Silas sat in the doorway, the wood of the porch creaking beneath him. His hands were steady as he sharpened a tool, but his eyes had gone somewhere far off, like they were seeing smoke that wasn't there. He didn't speak for a long while. "I buried my past to keep it from swallowing me," he finally said. "Thought if I stayed quiet, the world would leave me alone. But it don't work that way. Truth always comes crawling back up through the dirt." Lettie stood behind him, arms wrapped tight around herself. "I don't want you to go down there," she whispered. "I'll go. I'll explain." Silas looked up at her. "No," he said. "They'll twist your words till they break." He rose, taller than she remembered, his shoulders bent, but not broken. "If they want to drag ghosts out into the light, then fine. But they're going to see every scar they gave me, every one I earned, and they'll see I didn't bury my life up here, I rebuilt it." The wind howled louder now, stirring ash from the fire pit and rattling the cabin walls. 3 days. That's all they had. The town hall creaked like a ship ready to sink, its old timbers groaning under the weight of bodies and judgment. Every seat was filled, every wall leaned against, and even the windows had faces pressed to the glass. They'd come for a spectacle, some righteous indignation, and perhaps a taste of scandal. Pritchard stood near the front, dressed like a man ready for war, his hair slicked back and his voice already clearing in preparation. The judge sat at a worn desk with peeling varnish, gavel in hand. Eyes narrowed from the long ride and the longer list of complaints delivered by Pritchard's eager mouth. Silas and Lettie entered together. She wore her best dress, plain but clean, and had braided her hair the way she used to when her father was still alive. Silas walked beside her, coat buttoned high, eyes forward. The room quieted for a moment as they passed. People stared at Lettie with sideways glances and whispered behind hands. Her shoulders hunched slightly under their weight, but she didn't falter. She walked like a girl who had learned to plant seeds in frozen soil. "Mr. Granger," the judge began, tapping his gavel once, "you stand accused of taking unlawful custody of a minor, of isolating her from the community, and by implication of acts that bring shame to decent society. Do you understand these accusations?" Silas nodded once. "I understand someone's been spreading lies." Pritchard stepped forward before the judge could speak. "Your Honor, I have sworn testimony from townsfolk who have seen this girl alone in the woods, speaking nonsense, painting strange symbols, and living without supervision under the roof of a man known to be volatile. This man lost his own family in mysterious circumstances, and now he's taken in a vulnerable girl abandoned by her mother whose whereabouts are unknown. The girl, by all accounts, may not be well. What would you call that, if not sin and secrecy?" Lettie flinched as murmurs rippled through the room. Silas's jaw tensed. Her mother gave her away, like livestock. Dalton dropped her off in the woods, and she nearly froze to death. I brought her into my home, fed her, gave her warmth. That's not sin. That's survival. Miss Maynard rose slowly from the benches at the side. Her voice was steady, low but clear. "I've seen them. I've been to that cabin. Lettie was not taken, she was saved. And if any of you doubt that, perhaps you'll believe her own words." She held up a bundle of papers, worn and bent at the corners. "Letters," she said, "written by Lettie herself. Journals. She never meant to share them, but I found them while helping clean after the storm. She wrote about kindness, about learning how to breathe again, about healing. Not once did she speak of fear. Not once did she cry out for help." She handed them to the judge. He read silently for a long moment, then aloud. "He doesn't talk much, but he listens with his eyes. Sometimes I think that's better than all the words in the world." Silence settled over the room. Not righteous, not stunned, just silence. Lettie stood straighter now, her cheeks flushed, her voice soft but clear. "He never touched me wrong, never raised a hand. He made me tea when I was sick. He built me shelves for my paintings. He let me stay." The judge looked from her to Silas, then to the room. "This isn't a trial of sin," he said finally. "It's a trial of conscience, and I fear many here have failed that test long before today." Pritchard opened his mouth, but no one listened. The crowd had turned quiet, not with anger, but with shame. A girl had spoken the truth, and for once, the truth had been heard. The courtroom still held its breath when Miss Maynard reached into her satchel and pulled out a folded, yellowed envelope. Its edges were worn, the ink faded but intact, the handwriting unmistakably masculine, firm, looping letters, full of warmth even through the years. She looked at Lettie first, then the judge. "I wasn't going to bring this," she said softly, "but some truths rot in silence. This one deserves to be spoken." She stepped forward and handed the envelope to the judge. I found it tucked in the lining of an old quilt her mother left behind, hidden like it was never meant to be read. It's from Lettie's father, written just before he died. The judge opened it carefully, unfolding the pages with fingers slow and deliberate. The courtroom was still, all eyes locked on the crinkling of paper. He cleared his throat and began to read. "To my Lettie, if this letter ever finds your hands, know first that I love you. I have always loved you. From the moment I held you in my arms, soft and squalling, I saw nothing but beauty. The world may tell you otherwise. Your mother already does. She carries a bitterness I cannot mend, born of a hard life and a harder heart. She blames you for things no child should carry, for the weight she never lost, for the looks she no longer draws, for the dreams she buried the day you were born. But none of that is yours to bear. She says your size is a shame. I say it's the softness that saved me. She says your quiet makes you useless. I say it makes you strong. There is a light in you, Lettie, that the world will try to snuff out again and again. Do not let them. Do not believe them. And if I'm not there one day to tell you this, find someone who sees you the way I do, someone who sees the whole of you and calls it good. I pray you'll find peace somewhere, somehow. Maybe in the hills, where the noise of the world can't reach. Maybe with someone who knows how to build a fire and sit in silence and listen when words fail. You deserve that, my girl. You deserve it all. With love eternal, your papa. The judge's voice cracked on the last line. No one spoke. Not the women in the back with their knitting forgotten in their laps. Not the men whose arms were crossed tighter now, eyes downcast. Not the pastor, not even Pritchard, whose jaw had slackened slightly, his tongue heavy with sudden, unfamiliar doubt. The silence shattered something. The judge folded the letter with reverence and laid it on the table. This court sees no crime in kindness, no guilt in guardianship, and no sin in surviving what others would not have borne. Pritchard stepped forward, desperate. That's one man's letter. The judge raised a hand. And you, Mr. Pritchard, would use this town's good name to smear an innocent girl and a grieving man, all to chase your own ambition. Whispers rippled like wind through dry grass. Accusations flipped direction. Eyes turned on Pritchard now, not with admiration, but suspicion. He saw it. He felt it. And for the first time since climbing his ladder of lies, Elias Pritchard looked uncertain. The truth, penned in a father's steady hand, had done what no shouting could. It exposed the real villain. Not the man in the mountains, but the one in the suit. The town hall, once so full of hungry eyes and whispered judgments, had gone quiet in a way that made people shift in their seats, unsure of their own breath. The judge had not yet spoken again, but his expression had said enough. The letter rested like a stone on the desk before him, heavy with truth, and its words echoed still in the minds of all who heard them. Not a soul dared meet Silas Granger's gaze, except Lettie, whose hand remained gently folded in her lap, her back straight, her face flushed, not with fear but with the fire of something new. Dignity. Silas rose slowly, not called upon, but compelled. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't speak loud, but when his voice came, it carried. "I ain't a man of many words," he began. "Most of you know that, or think you do. You see a mountain man, a ghost who never comes down, and you fill in the rest with what suits your need. But I ain't been hiding from you. I've been trying to live with what the world took from me. My wife, my little girl burned up in that cabin because I was too far out chasing meat to keep the fire right. That blame's never left me." He paused, eyes fixed on a point beyond the crowd. "But when I found Lettie in those woods, near frozen and left like she was nothing, I couldn't walk away, couldn't do to her what the world had done to me." A woman in the back let out a sound, half sob, half gasp, and covered her mouth with her hand. "She's not a burden. She's not broken. She's the first thing that made sense in a long time," Silas said. "And she didn't ask for anything but a place to sit and be seen. That's all. And I gave it. You call that sin? Then we're all damned." He stepped back, said no more. Lettie didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence said what words couldn't. Her courage had already stood its ground in the face of accusation, and now the weight of it shifted slowly into the hearts of those who once condemned her. The seamstress wiped her eyes. The blacksmith clenched his jaw, then looked down in shame. A farmer shook his head and whispered, "Lord, forgive us." The judge finally rose, voice grave. "This town has allowed its fear to masquerade as morality, its prejudice to wear the cloak of virtue. And in doing so, you nearly destroyed two people who had only ever done good. This court finds no crime committed, except perhaps by those who would wield the law like a blade instead of a shield." Pritchard sputtered, stepping forward. "This is absurd. That man, he's manipulated all of you. That girl, she was abandoned for a reason." The judge turned his glare on him. "And what's your reason, Mr. Pritchard? For turning grief into profit? For preying on a girl's shame and a man's solitude?" A murmur of anger rolled through the crowd, now not against Silas, not against Lettie, but toward the man in the polished boots and smug coat. Pritchard looked around, realizing too late that no one would defend him. He turned, shoulders rigid, and shoved through the crowd, leaving behind his ambition and his lies, trailing the cold breath of failure behind him. The doors closed behind him with a thud, and inside, the townsfolk stayed standing not in defiance, but in humility. Tears glistened, heads bowed, and hearts, long closed, began to open. That day, it wasn't just Silas and Lettie who were freed. The whole town began to heal. The road back up the mountain felt different this time. Not shorter, not easier, but lighter, somehow. The burden that had hung over Silas's shoulders for years, invisible but crushing, had slipped away bit by bit with each step down the courthouse stairs. Lettie walked beside him, her shawl pulled tight, her eyes on the dirt trail ahead. She didn't speak much, but she didn't need to. There was something in the way she carried herself now, a quiet steadiness, like a tree that had learned to bend with the wind but never break. When they reached the clearing, the cabin looked the same as it always had. Smoke curling from the chimney, the goats bleating from the pen, the same weathered porch steps. But something had changed, not in the boards or the stones, but in the space between them. It felt like coming home not to a hiding place, but to a beginning. Silas didn't go straight inside. He walked the perimeter of the garden plot, boots crunching through dry grass and scattered weeds. Lettie followed him out with a basket, pulling up the first tender green shoots she'd planted before the hearing. She held them in her hands, like treasure. "Not bad," he muttered, crouching beside her to test the soil. "Still too loose on that east corner," she nodded. "I'll shore it up with river stones." He grunted approval, and for a while they worked in silence, side by side, the rhythm of shovels and hands and breathing filling the space between them. Later that evening, as the sky bruised with dusk, Silas returned from the woodpile carrying something under his arm. Inside the cabin, Lettie had rearranged the hearth, swept the floor, and scrubbed the iron pot until it gleamed. When he entered, she looked up from the carving in her hands, a small bird, wings tucked in, its belly round and smooth. Silas set his burden down beside the fire. It was a chair, rough-hewn, sturdy, shaped by calloused hands and patience. He set it next to the old one, side by side, two chairs where, once there had been one. She didn't say, "Thank you." He didn't ask her to. Instead, she handed him the bird, still unfinished. "For the mantle," she said. He turned it over in his hands. "Needs a perch. I'll carve it tomorrow." He nodded and set it gently beside the fire. That night, they sat in their chairs, both facing the flames. She carved while he mended a bit of harness. The quiet was warm, whole. He looked at her once, only once, and saw not the girl from the woods or the frightened shadow at his door, but someone who had grown into the space she now claimed, someone who had brought life back to his home, not with noise or demands, but with presence. In the corner, her paintings hung like windows to a world remade. On the shelf, the music box sat unopened, no longer a wound, just a memory. Outside, the stars came out. Inside, there were two chairs by the fire, and for the first time in a very long while, both were filled. The church had never known color. Its walls were whitewashed every spring, the pews scrubbed down with vinegar and pride, and the windows, though clean, let in only pale light that seemed afraid to touch anything too deeply. It stood at the edge of Sycamore Ridge like a moral sentinel, square-shouldered and silent, weathered by years of sermons and the rustle of shame-laced whispers. But now, above the altar where once there had been only bare wood and blank space, a painting bloomed. It wasn't announced. No grand unveiling, no trumpet of approval from the pulpit. One Sunday, the congregation arrived to find ladders and drop cloths in the aisle. The next, they found Lettie standing at the front, brush in hand, a rag tucked in her apron. Some paused in the doorway. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but none turned away. She painted with slow, careful strokes, and over the course of 2 weeks, the wall transformed. A garden took shape, lush, green, and sprawling, with flowers curling around fence posts and vines climbing the corners like they had a secret to share. In the center was a girl, plump, barefooted, with a braid falling down her back and her hands buried in soil. Her dress was plain, her eyes soft. She wasn't kneeling in worship or raising her arms to heaven. She was simply tending the earth, as if God himself had told her that to grow something beautiful was praise enough. Off to the side, under the shadow of a tree, stood a man, tall and broad, with his arms crossed loosely and his face turned not toward the sky but toward the girl, watching her, not as a keeper or a judge, but as someone who had once known silence and now found peace in the sound of planting. On the final Sunday, the mural was complete. The townspeople sat in their pews, quieter than usual. The organ hadn't started. The reverend hadn't spoken. They simply looked. No one pointed. No one whispered, but even the children fell still. Some craned their necks to take it all in. One little girl tugged at her mother's sleeve and whispered, "Is that the mountain girl?" And though her mother hushed her, the answer was clear. It wasn't a likeness, not exactly, but it was Lettie, and it was Silas. It was the garden they built together, and the quiet redemption neither of them had asked for but had found just the same. After the service, people lingered. Some stared up at the mural for long minutes, their mouths parted slightly, as if trying to understand something their hearts had already grasped. Others touched Lettie's hand as they passed her small gestures, shy thanks, a squeeze of the wrist. Children came back during the week. They stood in the aisle, looking up, making stories in their heads about the girl who planted hope and the man who watched with love, guarding the roots. Lettie never signed her name, but she didn't have to. The story was there in every brushstroke, every leaf and shadow. It was a quiet testimony, not of sermons, but of second chances, and of what grows when kindness is given room to take root. The morning sun spread like honey over the ridgeline, soft and golden, slipping through the pine branches and casting long, amber shadows over the trail. The earth was warm beneath their boots, the path winding gently beneath their feet. Lettie walked just ahead, her shawl trailing slightly, a basket slung over one arm filled with early-picked herbs and a few carved wooden birds she planned to trade in town. The wind tugged playfully at the ends of her braid, and her cheeks, usually pale, glowed with the light of morning and movement. Silas walked beside her, hands in his pockets, a quiet ease in his step. He didn't carry his rifle today. There was no need. The mountain no longer felt like a place to guard, but a place to share, with her, with whoever chose to see it for the sanctuary it was. They reached the overlook just before midday, a patch of high, flat rock with nothing but open air before them. The valley spread out below like a painting in motion, the river glinting like silver thread, the trees swaying in slow rhythm, the church spire in town catching the light just so. From up here, the world seemed both vast and small, reachable, gentle. Lettie stepped to the edge and breathed it in. The wind pressed against her like an embrace. She didn't speak for a while, just watched the town that once tried to break her, now quietly folding her into its story. "I never thought I'd come back up here," she said finally, her voice almost lost to the breeze. "Not like this." Silas looked at her, really looked. The girl he'd found, half frozen and silent in the snow, had become something steady, something sure. Her eyes were calm now, not full of flinching or fear. Her hands, once trembling, were calloused from carving and planting. Her voice, once a whisper, now carried. "I didn't think I'd let anyone stay," he replied. "But you did. You stayed." She turned to him, brows furrowed just slightly, as if searching his face for something more. He took a step closer. "I spent years thinking I was meant to live alone," he said, "that what I lost meant I had nothing left to give. But you brought it back, bit by bit, quiet as spring coming through the snow." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. Inside was a carving, smooth and simple. A woman standing tall, one hand reaching down toward a sapling growing at her feet. He handed it to her. "I thought I'd lost my family," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But I didn't. I just hadn't met you yet." She blinked hard, her breath catching, her fingers closed around the carving. "You're not my burden, Lettie," he said, steady and true. "You are my blessing." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't look away. She nodded, lips trembling into a smile. "And you're mine," she whispered. They stood there, side by side, the valley stretched before them, the mountain solid behind, a family not born of blood but of choice, of survival, of love. Then, with the sun warming their backs and the wind at their heels, they walked on together into whatever would come next.